The Digital Banking Podcast is powered by Tyfone. Tyfone is a dramatically better digital banking provider. Our appeal is unique. We collaborate closely with our customers and the banking ecosystem in an open approach coupled with a powerful user experience that helps get things done. On our podcast, you will hear how digital banking plays a leading role for community-minded financial institutions from the unique perspectives of our industry expert guests.
All right, welcome to another episode of the Digital Banking Podcast. I'm your host, Josh Tatar. Today, we are excited to have Natasha Chilingerian on the show. Natasha is an executive editor at Credit Union Times. Natasha, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me, Josh. Appreciate it. I'm excited.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to give our listeners a little bit of background on yourself, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, your past experiences, and maybe what a day in the life looks like?
Okay, sure, will do. So I'm the executive editor for Credit Union Times, and I've been with Credit Union Times full-time for 5 years now. I've always been in journalism, but I actually stumbled into the credit union world by accident, like a lot of people have in this industry, about 10 years ago when I was living in South Carolina and I met a former CU Times editor, and he started giving me some freelance work for the publication. So at the time, I didn't even know what a credit union was, but I became a freelancer for a few years. Then I actually went to work for a credit union in Los Angeles in their marketing and communications department for 2 years. And then I came back to CU Times as a full-time editor in 2015. So what I do is, well, I'm fully remote. I've been a remote worker for a long time. So we actually don't have a central office. Everyone's at home. We have a pretty small staff. It's myself and one other editor. And then we have one full-time reporter and two freelancers. And we put out a print magazine twice a month. We also run our news website, and we have a daily e-newsletter. So what I do is I primarily manage the print magazine by assigning and editing all of the content. And I also do a lot of writing and producing editorial content for the website as well. So I mainly manage all of that written content behind the scenes. So I'm a total grammar nerd. I deal with words all day.
I always triple check my emails before I send them to you.
That's good.
Make sure
I appreciate that. I've been in that habit for a while. So yeah, I understand.
So many of us, we fall into the credit union industry and then we just never really fall out.
Exactly. Yeah, it's interesting. It's been like a happy surprise because in the beginning, it's like, what is this? I pictured myself working for like a lifestyle magazine in New York. What am I doing? But then now, like, it's really grown on me a lot. And I really love the industry just with how involved they are with the community, especially, and just rooting for the underdog and serving the underserved. I really enjoy all that. So yeah, it's been really cool.
That's awesome. So for those who may not know, do you want to tell us a little bit more about CU Times?
Sure. Like I said earlier, we have a print magazine twice a month, and then we have a daily news website. And so we cover, our tagline is trusted news for credit union leaders. It's a trade publication for credit union executives. And the topics that we cover, obviously digital banking is one of them. So that includes online mobile banking, payment platforms, also core systems that credit unions use. And then we also cover the other key areas would be regulation compliance, lending, marketing, cybercrime, fraud, and community news. So yeah, we like to think of ourselves as a top resource for credit unions looking to do their jobs better, looking to improve their strategies, and also on digital banking, of course, which especially during this pandemic is not just a nice to have, but a must have, having a strong digital banking strategy. So
I'll give the quick shameless plug. CU Times is definitely one of the areas that I go to make sure I stay on top of what's happening in our industry. So Thank you for being a part of that and putting that great information out for us.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah. I'm also pretty fortunate that we live in the same city. So I get to see you at different credit union happy hour events that you put on and things like that. And it's always really nice to have you as a resource to see what is happening in the industry. And one of the reasons why I really wanted to have you on the podcast today was you posted something on LinkedIn the other day that really piqued my interest. And it was that our single biggest, most important conference of the entire year, the CUNA GAC, for 2021 has officially announced that they're going to go virtual. And you reached out to your network to ask, what do you think? And for an industry that is so incredibly hyper connected and collaborative, and especially in an event like GAC, where we're physically hiking the hill to petition on behalf of the communities of credit unions, how do we do this virtually? So I'm really curious, what kind of feedback did you get? What were you expecting to hear? And what did you find?
Sure. Yeah, it was really an interesting announcement. I think, first of all, because it was 6 months in advance of this taking place. And I think, this whole pandemic, things have been it's hard to find out exactly what's happening. And it's hard to plan so far in advance because you just don't know what's going to happen next. But what I heard from my network when I did that LinkedIn post, people are obviously disappointed because I think the virtual event, it's the smartest option, obviously. We can't be gathering in person. I know some people are. I know people feel differently about the whole COVID thing, but I personally believe it's definitely smart not to plan anything in person at this point. But the programs, and there have actually been some other credit union conferences this year I've watched that have been virtual. And they're okay. The content is okay, but it's just not going to be the same as being in person. And that's what I got in a lot of the feedback when I asked my network about how they felt about it. So you can log on to a webinar. The speakers can be great. They can give you some great content. It can be great for the purpose of just learning. And for my purpose, I'll go to these conferences and take notes for stories that I write. And so the virtual format was also fine for that purpose. Like I would get the information I needed for the story. But there's no running into someone in the hallway or chatting at the hotel bar or going out for dinner. There's something about getting to travel to a destination and explore that place and then share that experience with other people. And it creates a bonding and it builds relationships with different colleagues that you work with. So I feel like there's really no easy solution for this situation because it wouldn't be safe or smart to hold it in person, but it's also not going to be fantastic to hold it virtually. So I don't know. It'll be interesting to see what they do and how they can make it a good experience. I know some virtual conferences I've watched this year, they've tried to tie in that social element somehow to the virtual experience. And I don't know how everyone feels about this, but I feel like it's just not going to be the same. There was one that I attended. It was from PSCU, which is a large payments QSO in the industry. Mm-hmm. They had their virtual event that I attended, and they did something where they shipped a small little insulated mug to your doorstep, through FedEx, and it had a note and it said, oh, you can use this to make your own cocktail and you can sit and enjoy a happy hour. And then we're going to have this comedian performing virtually for everyone and you can chat or whatever. It's supposed to be replacing that in-person happy hour reception. But I don't know. For me, I was I really appreciate the effort. I thought it was really cute, but it just made me sad at the same time.
Yeah.
No, I want to be there in person. So I think they're really trying to recreate the social aspect, but I just don't think it's going to work. I'm sure like everyone else, really looking forward to when we can gather in person again. But for now, this is just the only option we have.
I feel like I've always had delusions of being an introvert. I'm a total introvert. And then 2020's pandemic hit and I was like, oh, no, all the people. I need all the people. I'm a hugger. Let's get together. This is hard. And it is. It's really astonishing just how many people have become close personal friends and people that I want to interact with and socialize with from the community that I work in. And so much of that has come from those in-person events. And so I'm with you. As a vendor, it's difficult, right? Because sometimes we're having to look at potential black and white ROI. And it's just not that simple when you're looking at these virtual trade shows. And sometimes it is, it's just putting in the effort, right? We have to have it virtual because we can't just cancel it. There's still way too much positive that comes out of holding these events. And while it may not be perfect, we got to do something because we have to keep this alive. We've got to keep that energy and that passion going as much as we can. We've got to keep that hyper connectivity. And as a digital banking company, we preach the connectivity of digital. So we've got to live it in this digital world. It's a really interesting time. But like you said, I really appreciate the folks that are trying. We're going to have a lot of failures. Let's be honest. This doing 100% virtual remote conferences is really new. So we're going to have a lot of failures, but we've got to get through those to find the successes. So I don't know. Did you find anything that came out of some of these that were kind of like aha moments? Like, oh, wow, that actually works very well in virtual.
I think, and I've seen quite a few of them already. We've been in this for 6 months now. I think one lesson that some of the hosts learned was you have to make it short. You can't go on as long as a normal conference would go in real life, because in your real life, you take breaks, you go get a cup of coffee, mosey around. I'm sure you've heard of this Zoom fatigue thing where you're just sitting and staring and you're in front of the computer so long, and people will just get tired of that. You'll get physically tired from tuning in on Zoom for so long. So I think cutting it short has been, I've noticed them doing that. So instead of having a 4-day conference, it would be like maybe a maximum of 2 days, and then just maybe a max of 4 hours during the day. That's been something. But yeah, I don't know. I still don't think there's a way we can recreate in-person experiences online. And I think we're noticing that just in all areas of our life this year during this pandemic. I know we talked a few weeks ago when we saw each other like at a distance out in a park, and you were saying how like your friendships that you have become more in depth, which is really cool. And I've noticed that too, where it's like the people I do know, I talk to them more, but it's shut the door on being able to like make new friends during this pandemic or make new connections. I think people are just learning and they're trying to get used to it and find a way to stay connected during this time. And I'm in a few different online groups. They're trying to have virtual events and Slack conversations going. And it's okay, but it just still isn't a replacement. I feel like that spills over into work life as well. Because yeah, like you, I love going out in the community. Portland has a lot of those in-person events through Y Cup and the meetups that we do every other month. And yeah, I miss that a lot. It's really hard. It feels like a year of lost connections in a way. Not to sound too pessimistic, but
no, I couldn't agree more. It's interesting. We're finding some balances in that, I think. But at the end of the day, if you're looking at it as a percentages game, yeah, you're just missing opportunities to meet new people, to have new experiences, to gain new insight. And we're finding new ways to make it happen. But I don't know about you. When somebody says, well, let's have a virtual happy hour, I'm like, oh, no, I've been on my computer for 16 hours already today. I'm going to go sit on the couch with my wife. And if I'm going to have a drink, I'm going to have it.
Those were cute for like maybe the first month of lockdown. Yeah. And then everyone's okay, I'm done with this.
Okay. Yep. No, we're good. Are you seeing that be a trend that we're pushing conferences and things like that to virtual even into 2021 already? Does GAC seem to be an early outlier?
They seem to be an early outlier. And it's actually interesting. Right before I got on to record this podcast, I got an email from NACUSO, the organization, and they are actually holding theirs in person at the end of March, they announced, in Vegas. So I got that email. And, you know, I chatted a little bit with my editor-in-chief, Michael, and he said, my guess is that they probably couldn't get out of their contract. So I think a lot of it is around, they've already had this lined up with the venue. And so now they're trying to find a way to do it, but try to do it safely. So I think, yeah, when it comes to 2021, GAC is the first one I've heard of that is going virtual. Everything else is virtual so far for 2020, except I know there is one conference that's taking place in Idaho. I'll have to look up the actual name. It's the Association of Credit Union Managers. It's a group. And they are holding it in person. And it was interesting on their website. They actually said that they're going to hand out colored wristbands and that'll signal to others what level of interaction you're comfortable with. So if it's like a red wristband, you're saying, hey, I'm just here to learn. Leave me alone. I'm nice, but I don't want to catch COVID. So stay at a distance. And then a yellow one was like, I'm open to talking at a 6-foot distance. And then green was, I'm not concerned at all about social distancing. Come as close as you want. I don't know. Just creep me out a little bit, to be honest. I don't think the virus cares what color wristband you're wearing. So I don't know. It's interesting. So I guess that's happening. That's the only in-person event I've known of.
Gotcha.
That I've heard about so far. But yeah, everything else has been virtual. Yeah, I wouldn't say it's a trend because it's something people want to do. I think they're doing it because they have to do it.
Yeah. I quite frankly count my blessings every day that I'm in an industry that has been able to operate remotely. And to some degree, granted, we can't do conferences and things like that, we can go about our normal business. I mean, I can't even imagine. I was listening to a podcast over the weekend with the gentleman who started the Spartan races. And he said, immediately, overnight, my entire business model was done.
Wow.
You can't do a Spartan race virtually.
Exactly.
What are you going to do? Set up obstacles in your living room and jump over them? He was like,
exactly. Yeah. No, there's somewhere it's just, it just can't be done.
Just can't be done. So it's going to be a really interesting landscape to navigate as these companies, we as exhibitors have a contract to attend a conference, and the conference has a contract to use this hotel. Who's going to make the decision where and how does it fall? I think you're going to see a lot of variation in that over the next 6 to 12 months even.
Right. Well, I also the one silver lining of it as well is the money everyone saved on travel, and also the time we've gotten back to work, because I know traveling takes up so much time and you can get behind. And I've had that experience before where it's just so much scrambling. So it's nice to just focus on work and not be, okay, I've got to make up for this day I'm traveling and missed all this email and stuff. So
I remember
I'm trying to find a positive.
I remember not too long ago when PDX was my second home. I mean, it was,
same.
I spent a lot of time on the road, and don't get me wrong, I'm absolutely ecstatic to be spending more time at home with my family. But then you're also like, oh man, those rewards points accounts are sure depleted. It's an interesting dynamic, right? Of not having travel as a part of what we do. You might find this interesting. So we are working with a credit union who is kind of in their final stages of a digital banking evaluation. And they made a comment to us and said, for a contract this important and a selection this important, when we're really and truly trying to find out who the right partner for us is going forward in this space, normally this would have meant you guys probably would have been on site 10 plus times.
Wow.
And we've never met them in person because we started talking to them after the pandemic hit. It's a really interesting, like I said, you make it work, you learn, but it is interesting that we would have had probably a potentially very different relationship because we had met so many times in person.
You feel like you still successfully completed the project that way?
Yeah, and that's what's really cool. But I think that it takes the right types of groups on both sides of it. Just a perfect example, we've had those types of doing what we do. We do these remote demos. And we've had ones with that credit union that there's just everybody's on camera, everybody's super enthusiastic, lots of questions. And then we've had ones where no one is on camera, nobody says anything. That's a lot harder. There would be a lot more relationship building in an in-person type of setting.
Some people just do better in person.
Yeah.
Communicate. So there's a learning curve.
Like you said, some of us just hit this Zoom fatigue too. And that poor credit union may have been on 6 demos previously, and you're just like, I'm ready to check out.
Right, absolutely.
I don't blame you one bit.
So I was just going to say on that, what we've heard a lot of about this year on the technology side for credit unions is credit unions that had a core conversion plan or a digital banking conversion of some kind, having to do that all remotely. And a lot of them have done it and they've succeeded. So we've run quite a few stories on how they made it all work. So I'm sure it took some adjusting and a bit of a learning curve just on communicating remotely effectively. But I think we're also lucky to be in an industry where it's possible to do it remotely, unlike a restaurant or a place that's totally, these businesses obviously that are suffering now aren't so lucky.
Yeah, it's interesting. I liken it to, your first time jumping in the pool or something. And you're like, oh my gosh, this is so scary. And it takes you so long to build up. And finally you jump in and then you're like, oh, this is not so bad.
Yeah, it's almost scarier when you're running to the pool. Once you get in, you're fine.
And I think we're seeing some of that in our industry where it's previously we would have said doing a completely remote digital banking conversion with no one on site. No, that's just not possible. We have to be on site. And then you do it and you're like, oh, actually, this is totally possible. We can still pull this off. I think it was you did a virtual happy hour early on, and somebody said something on there that really stuck with me. And they were like, yeah, we had normally said we would put a plan in place to help remote workers eventually. And IT was like, we need to be involved. And HR was like, well, that needs to fall on us. And then COVID hit and they figured it all out in a day.
Exactly.
And they were like, oh, so we could have figured this out in a day a year ago too.
Yep.
But we just needed that push into the pool.
Exactly. Yeah, the remote work has been really interesting for me because I've worked remotely full time for about 7 years. And so I've always been the one's just the odd one out doing this. It works really well for me. I'm very independent when I work. So for me, it's better. I don't have that distraction of sitting in an office and someone coming over and interrupting me. So I really prefer it this way. But yeah, it was so interesting because I know a lot of credit unions and other organizations, of course, have said for years, okay, no, a remote policy is not going to work. It would take us, or we're working on it, but I think it's like a 2 to 3 year plan. We have to get IT involved and make sure it's all going to work. So they made it sound like this kind of impossible thing. And then COVID hit, and then it's, oh, we did it in a weekend. So it really showed that it wasn't that it couldn't be done. It wasn't that it would take several years. And it just showed that it wasn't a priority. And maybe they're making some excuses for why it wasn't being done. And then it also showed what they're capable of accomplishing when just put under pressure. And that can apply to a lot of things, not just going to remote work.
That's
but
right.
it's
No, that
really,
was
cool.
It was Brian from Rivermark. Shout out to
was it Brian?
Brian from Rivermark, right? Yeah, he was saying, but at the same token, right, I think that it speaks volumes about a leadership team. Right. Being able to say, okay, our hand has been forced. So we have a couple of different ways that we can approach that now. So what's our choice? Do we just jump in the pool and figure out how to swim? Or do we let that fear consume us and we sit on the sidelines? I don't know.
Well, in this situation, they couldn't. I don't think they had the choice. With COVID, especially in the beginning, everyone was on lockdown. You weren't able to go in person. So it was a forced decision that had to be made. And I think now that they made the decision and some people started working remotely, they're getting more comfortable with it. And I've heard from several credit unions where they're going to let a part of their staff continue, even after the pandemic's over, working remotely or a hybrid of on-site and remote work after this, because they find, hey, it's not that bad. I don't need to be looking over someone's shoulder to make sure they're working all day. There's definitely some learning curves for the remote work side as well. I think one of them is making sure that you can trust your employees to do their work. And it's not all about showing up and being in your seat at 8 a.m. and that you're there, because that doesn't necessarily mean you're producing good work. And when you're at home, they can't see whether you're in your seat or not. It's not about, oh, I'm here physically. It's about what quality of work am I producing? What am I actually putting out there? So I think it's a real positive for a lot of people. And it also showed, which this is not such a positive for the people in this situation, but I think there were some roles I've just heard anecdotally where once they started working from home, they realized you're not really producing anything. And they ended up maybe eliminating that person's position because they realized you're there physically, you're in your seat, you're at work doing whatever, but you're not actually producing work. So I think working at home, it just becomes, what is the output? And you got to have trust too with employees when you're doing that.
A good team member is a good team member, right?
Right.
Regardless of where or when they work.
Exactly.
Somebody who has good work ethic and guiding moral principles, and they put in the time and they turn out quality work. They're going to do that whether they're in the office or whether they're home more.
Of course.
But I think you probably have a pretty unique perspective on this as well, as someone who has been work from home for a very long time when it wasn't a necessity. What kind of things have you seen just in your professional and even personal circles? How have other people adapted to that? What's that been like? Has that been interesting for you?
It has been interesting, yeah. And not even just in my industry, but I have a really good friend in town who's a school teacher. And so she obviously has been dealing with the distance learning and all that. But yeah, she loves it because I think you get time back in your day that you would have spent waking up, getting ready, driving into work, commuting, and all of that. She really noticed that she has all this time back. And it's very interesting figuring out, like, when am I going to fit in my workout and adding in a home workout there because the gyms were closed also, obviously. Yeah. But one thing I think people struggle with is when to turn it off, like when to be done working for the day. And that took me some time as well. But you kind of have to be disciplined enough to say, okay, at this time, it's going off, the email notifications are getting turned off, and I'm going to have some kind of a way to signal the end of my workday and transition into the evening.
Yeah.
That's really important because otherwise you can just be on constantly and on the weekends. So I think you got to have that self-discipline to set boundaries around that. And a lot of that involves setting boundaries with other people you're working with because they might just email you at night on the weekends. And if you respond at that time, then you're enabling that behavior. So I would encourage everyone to set clear boundaries on your work.
I'd love to get your thoughts on two different areas of that. One, I think it was really interesting for me. Work from home was not something new for me either. Granted, I haven't been doing it as long as you have, but I kind of had the processes and the structures in place and a place in my home to do it. And going into post-COVID work from home was different though, because what I found was it was really hard to turn it off and say, all right, it's 5:00. Eric and I are going to go out to dinner, or I'm going to go hang out at a friend's house or something like that. When all of those social activities got shut down, I was like, well, it's 5:00. I can either go sit on my couch and watch garbage TV, or I can at least be productive and accomplish something and keep working. And then for those of you who don't know Natasha and I personally, we're both in Portland, Oregon, which right now is covered in a lot of smoke and hazardous air quality. So now even just going for a walk around the block is not really possible.
Yeah.
So any tips or tricks you have on thinking about shutting it down and separating work and life when there's just such a blur?
Yeah, first, I totally agree with that. And I think a lot of people working from home, you're missing that social interaction. But at least before COVID, we could have that social interaction after work or on the weekends. So that's how I managed to sustain it for so long, is that I would be pretty much isolated during the workday. But then in the evenings and on the weekends, I always would be meeting up with friends or doing something social. So that kind of balanced it out for me. But yeah, once COVID hit, that wasn't an option anymore. And I felt like actually in the beginning of COVID, I didn't set very good boundaries for myself for work because I was feeling like one thing is that there was a lot more work to do because everyone's in crisis mode. So there was just a lot of things happening at work. I think with a lot, just the credit union branches are shutting down. So we're following that in the news and reporting on that. They're putting out communications to members. So it was just a busy time. Yeah. And then I also felt, like you said, there wasn't anything better for me to do on the weekends. So might as well just productive. Yeah. And then it was also a good distraction because I think emotionally, this whole pandemic thing has been so hard. And when it first hit, it was such a shock. And I felt like just working more hours was a good, healthy distraction for me. So I wouldn't be like doom scrolling on my phone or watching the news and freaking out about it. So I do agree. You're right about that. It's hard to set the boundaries because those leisurely options that we had before are not there anymore. And then now with the smoke, you can't even take a walk around the block. So that at least we had that a few weeks ago, but now we're really screwed. Really all you're left with is what things can you do at home that are relaxing? For me, that's like home workouts. So I usually like around 3 or 4 p.m., I'll start winding down my day. And I can do that because I work with a lot of folks on the East Coast. So the emails will slow down around that time. So I'll always take a break around that time, do a home workout class, shower, and then kind of circle around and wrap up my work. And then I'll start cooking dinner, getting some shows on that I enjoy. And then, I don't know, just whatever hobbies I have at home. But I would say find some hobbies or things at home, whether it's TV, exercising, cooking, making a cocktail. Try to, I would say, carve out like a routine for yourself in the evening that has a few things that just aren't work related that you can do at home that'll be relaxing. I know it's hard because it's lame, but it's, we don't have many options.
Yeah. Yeah. No, actually, legitimately, we're getting back to knitting and crocheting. Right?
Pretty much. Yeah. I've been cross stitching. That's been my quarantine hobby. So I'm in grandma mode.
That's awesome. You made a comment a minute ago too that I wanted to circle back to. It's one of the things that I found really interesting about going from this, there's specific subsets of people that work from home to the vast majority of people working from home. What I've also found is that a lot of people are struggling trying to find their time and place to work, and especially those with kids at home. When the kids are up and need attention or need help with doing distance learning or things like that, you can't really work and do that at the same time. One of my neighbors sent me a joke news article that has just stuck with me through it. It was, I want to say it was even the Wall Street Journal or somebody big publicized this. And it was the top 10 jobs that you can do working from home and having small kids. And number 10 was like no job. And number 9 was like, no, seriously, there's no job. And number 8 was like, no, this is not possible. And so one of the things that I feel like I've noticed is that a lot of folks who are having to try and balance a lot of things are then finding these odd hours to get their work done. So then that coworker where you normally would have interacted 8 to 5 is now sending you the 10 p.m. email. But for you, it works easier to send them a 6 a.m. email. And so then they feel obligated to respond to your 6 a.m. email and you feel obligated to respond to their PM email. That whole 8 to 5 just feels gone. I don't know. Have you experienced that?
Not so much with because my staff, again, at CU Times, we've been remote this whole time. And I think only one of them has kids at home, but the others have kids that are older and out of the house, so they don't have that problem. It hasn't really changed for me as much with, I guess, emails at different times. But yeah, I have heard stories like that. I think the key is just staying flexible. Some of the credit unions we've heard from who talked about the challenges of going to remote work is that they have to realize, okay, this is an emergency situation. This is a crisis. People have kids at home or elderly parents, maybe they're caring for. So you have to just put that first. You have to be just flexible in responses with projects and timelines on things to a degree. So yeah, it's definitely a challenge. But yeah, I have a lot of respect for those folks that are doing the distance learning and working. I have no clue how you
Yeah, I don't know how you're pulling it off. You deserve a gold star, a trophy, a D, all of the above.
Yeah, that's insane. But I think it's definitely been an adjustment overall for people and just it's been a trial and error process of figuring out what works. But I think I would say another sort of tip for dealing with all these different schedules and communication is, if you're going to remote work for the first time, establish with your coworkers and your boss what the expectations are around how much am I going to communicate with you throughout the day, at what times, and talk about that ahead of time so there aren't like surprises where it's like, oh, well, I didn't hear back from you, or I feel like you left me hanging. If you discuss it, I think that's really key, is establishing what that's going to look like. And not only like how much are we checking in, but how are we checking in? Do you call? Do you send a Slack message? Do you text? Because there's so many ways to do that. And eventually, I have a really great rhythm with my staff right now. We just, like with Michael, my boss, we chat on the Slack channel all day just to stay in touch and talk about what we're working on. And then the others, it's mostly email. But that would be another tip, I think, is communication. Because when you can't see them and you can't just go up to them, it's like sometimes people will overcompensate by checking in too much, and then that can be annoying. Like, leave me alone. Come on.
Yeah. Find those balances. I will say one of the, I think, positives that's come out of this is I feel like what you were just saying, giving people a little bit of leeway and just respecting the situation that they're in. I feel like COVID forcing so many of us to work from home has also humanized us to some degree.
Yeah.
That's what I've found really interesting about all these Zoom calls. I remember if I would do a demo from home, and I felt terrible if Amazon came to the house and one of my dogs barked while I was on. I'm like, I'm so sorry.
Right.
To some degree, have this in the back of your head that whoever's on the other side is judging you, like, oh, they're not very professional. Their dog's barking in the background. And I feel like a lot of that has gone away because now you're like, oh, your dog's barking. It's okay. It's my kid that was screaming and drawing on the wall yesterday. Like, we're all good. We're all human. We have stuff going on. Like, you're seeing into people's lives because you're literally seeing into their homes when it's the background of their Zoom call.
Yeah, like you said, it humanized us. We're all dealing with the same crisis at the same time, obviously in very different ways, depending on our situation, but it's still in a way brought us together. And yeah, the work from home, you got to peek into someone's personal life, but I haven't felt like it's been uncomfortable or necessarily bad. I think it's more like help people bond maybe a little more like in the workplace as teammates. So it's not such a bad thing.
You'll find this funny. One of our customers on the East Coast who's been a long time Tyfone family member. I was on one of their weekly calls with their account management team. I like to pop into those periodically and things. And I popped in and I was like, oh my gosh, Chris, this is the first time I've seen you not in a suit. And it's because every interaction I've had with him previously was in professional settings where he's an executive at a East Coast credit union and always wears a suit. And here he was at home taking the call in a t-shirt. I was like, this is awesome.
Yeah.
And he was like, oh yeah, no, I don't really like wearing the suit. I'm a t-shirt person. So I think that we're finding those silver lining edge cases.
Definitely. No, it's interesting because like attire and fashion has been an area of big conversation topic throughout the pandemic. What's appropriate for Zoom? And even if you're not getting on Zoom, what do you wear to work in? Are you motivated enough if you're just wearing your pajamas or a robe? So it's interesting. I've always been a sweats or even a robe type person to work in, and I work just fine.
Yeah.
But yeah, for Zoom, I'll try to at least put on something casual, put on some makeup. But yeah, I think it's nice. We don't have to be so stuffy. Like, we don't have to be so rigid about that. I think it shows we can still do good work, even if we're dressed in a more laid back way. So I think it can make you feel more creative too. Not all uncomfortable in this tight.
I tell you what, I'm pulling the full Ron Burgundy. Since work from home, my wife works at Nike. Yeah. So I basically live from the waist down in Nike. So I'm in, Nike sweatpants or Nike basketball shorts type of thing. And then I'm about as drunk on the Kool-Aid of our brand as possible. So from the waist up, I live in a Tyfone t-shirt. And my wife is like, I don't know what you look like in anything other than Nike joggers and a Tyfone t-shirt anymore.
I know. And then
that's fashion now.
The rest of your clothes are just hanging sadly in your closet. Yeah. I saw this one meme and it was like, oh, my clothes probably think I died or something. I was like, that's how I feel. They've just been sitting there, all these dresses and,
unless you're sweatpants, you think I've died.
Yep.
So, one of the other things I wanted to circle back on that you'd made a comment about earlier is one of the things you've noticed is credit unions had their hand forced and they had to make some of these decisions. Are you starting to see that's changed the culture and they're willing to make other decisions that maybe aren't as directly related to COVID and going work from home faster and being willing to take more risks because they found that they were forced to take some risks and forced to do things very quickly and make decisions. And it actually worked out and they were able to pull it off. So are you seeing that bleed into other areas? And do you think that's going to have some staying power?
Yeah, no, that's interesting. One thing that just came to mind when you were saying that right away was the whole topic of DEI, when diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's been, I think, second to COVID has been one of the biggest issues we're dealing with this year with all of the racial injustice and all of the protests going on and everything. So I feel like in that sense, credit unions have definitely stepped up and been more proactive in addressing having a DEI strategy in their credit union, in their culture, like hiring a director of DEI, those types of things. I don't know if that's necessarily because they feel COVID forced them into the remote format and all that. I see what you're saying. I think that might have motivated them and to be that way in other areas too. So I don't know if the DEI thing is really because a result of that, or if it's just because of the climate we're in. It could be a combination of both, but that's one area I've definitely seen them step up on a lot. And otherwise, I haven't really heard any other areas where they've been able to take a risk more easily, but that'd be a good thing to look into. It could be a story idea. So,
yeah, I'm curious, like the conversation that we were having with Brian, right? It was this long drawn out process to allow some work from home. And then we just had to do it one day. And because we only had one day to do it, we did it in one day and we pulled it off. And then we realized, wow, we have a team of rock stars and they pulled stuff off. Let's unleash them on other things.
Yeah. I'm sure that's happening.
I'm curious to see what's happening in that. And I guess along those same lines, one of the things you have been covering is how that's affected physical stuff, right? Like branch buildings and opening new physical locations. So have you seen that change those strategies? And what have you been finding there?
It's interesting because obviously the shift to digital banking is a requirement. Even before the pandemic, it was a deal breaker for the credit union's survival. You have to have an app that's intuitive and you have to make it easy for people to do their banking remotely. Now it's obviously a complete deal breaker, but I've still been getting announcements pretty regularly this year of physical branches opening up. And I'm sure a lot of that is that they had the plans in place for that prior to the pandemic. So I'm sure they had the space and it wasn't something they could just pull out of. So now the ones that have been opening up these branches that most likely were in the works before the pandemic started, they're highlighting the fact that they're able to socially distance in the branch just based on the way it's laid out and emphasizing that safety aspect. And we did an article on it recently where we interviewed some credit unions that opened a branch, and they just said they acknowledged the fact that it's unusual during a pandemic, but they still felt like it was a good long-term business strategy in general to keep that brick and mortar presence. So it's been interesting because when this started, I thought, gosh, our branch is just going to go away completely? Are we even going to be able to do that? It sounds like they're really not willing to give up on that branch model right now at all. I haven't heard that's really happening. And I know that branches were important to credit unions prior to the pandemic because one thing that credit unions that makes them stand apart is being able to provide a real personalized service and build a relationship with the member. And a lot of that happens in person. And they're shifting to this new model of branch that's more like consultative. So you would go in as a member and It's not just standing in the teller line and doing a quick transaction, but it's working with a personal banker and really sitting down, getting advice and having it be that. And they were really focusing on making the atmosphere in the branch more welcoming, like coffee shop or lounge area, which obviously isn't working now with COVID. But yeah, it's been a really important part of the credit union strategy is having that physical, being part of the community, having that physical presence in a community is really important. So as of now, they're still pushing forward on that. So it's been interesting to see. It's very optimistic where they feel that it's still worth the investment. And they must feel that we are going to go back to normal at some point, which we hope so too, of course, that we are. So they're optimistic about it and they're still opening up. Yeah, it's very interesting. But obviously part of that is the digital part is still a critical piece of that. And the branch is one channel, but they focus on having all the channels work together. So like, let's say you can start a transaction on your phone, but then finish it in the branch. So that's a key thing that they focus on is having that seamless experience where there's different options of different channels you can work from, but they all work together at the same time so that you're not like starting something and then stopping. So that's a big part of the service strategy.
Yeah. It's interesting. I think if I were to look at it very self-servingly, obviously I would say that branches aren't needed and digital is everything. And I fall into that younger high-tech category. I'm an Apple junkie, but I still love my in-person branch. And I would be super remiss if it went away. And I had an opportunity to talk to Amber, the CEO of CU Prodigy, on the podcast the other week. And we were talking a lot about that because Amber's super personally passionate about the role that credit unions and community-minded FIs play in being pillars for their community. And I think that there is actually a huge disservice and a huge loss when a credit union closes a branch in an area. And I think that there's a ton of opportunity that comes when a credit union opens a branch. Absolutely. So I'm all for it. But I agree. I think that it's got to be a seamless blend, right? When I look at what digital banking offers, digital banking needs to be something where it's a self-service channel. And it's a channel that should be able to accomplish the very transactional nature elements of banking. But it also has to blend into the less transactional type things and the more relationship building type elements. But the more that the digital services providers, and not just digital banking, right? The massive ecosystem of fintechs, the core providers, you name it, the better we get at making those types of things, those transactional, those back office processes, the more that we can automate those, we can make them seamless, we can make them really clean, smooth user experiences for members. I think it opens the door for credit unions, like you said, to be even more than just a transactional element to their lives and have that more community consultative approach to the types of interactions they're having.
Exactly. I agree. Yeah.
Natasha, I think you and I could probably talk for the rest of the afternoon.
I know.
But I know we've overrun our time that we asked you for. And I can't thank you enough for just your insight and your thoughts and what you provide to this community and this industry with what you're doing with CU Times. Maybe in closing, to help with our listeners, can you share some of maybe your favorite resources and places you go to get information about the credit union industry?
Sure. Obviously, I would send everyone to CU Times. We have a lot of coverage on digital banking, so that would be my top pick, shameless plug. Other than that, as someone who's on the receiving end of the news coming in the industry, I mainly look to some of the biggest organizations in the credit union industry that work with credit unions either as a service provider or as a consultant. The big ones that I look at the most would probably be Callahan and Associates, the Filene Research Institute, of course, and then Co-op Financial Services and PSCU for the payments piece. And then also Fiserv, we're pretty plugged in with them. Obviously, they send us news directly that we use in our coverage, but then they put out their own content that's very useful as well. So I'd recommend any of those guys.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah. And then what if people want to learn more about you or get in touch with you or see some of the other work that you've done?
Yeah, obviously CU Times. So it's just cutimes.com. You can see the stories I've written there. And then also welcome to connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm pretty active there. I believe you can just search my first and last name, Natasha Chilingerian, on there and it should come up. And yeah, I'd love to hear from you. So feel free to reach out.
Awesome. Again, thank you so incredibly much for joining us today on the Digital Banking Podcast.
Thank you, Josh. Appreciate it. Take
Thanks,
care.
Natasha.
Stay safe. Okay.
Bye. Have a great day.
Thanks. You too.
Thank you for listening to the Digital Banking Podcast powered by Tyfone. Find more episodes on digitalbankingpodcast.com or subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Tyfone. Everyone builds features. Not everyone builds relationships. We build both.